For almost 80 years, Japan was one of the world's great economic powers, but a deliberately restrained military power. That is changing. Japan is now acquiring longer-range standoff weapons, strengthening its missile defense network, expanding its military capabilities, and preparing its self-defense forces to operate in a much more dangerous strategic environment. And this raises a fascinating question. Should India be worried about a rearming Japan, or should India actually welcome it?
Before we move forward, please like and subscribe to Strategic Vanguard, and please share our videos to be updated with the latest news, reviews, and expert analysis from the world of defense and strategic affairs.
The answer from an Indian strategic perspective may surprise you, because Japan's military transformation could create something India desperately needs in the Indo-Pacific, another powerful check on China. Welcome to Strategic Vanguard. Today, we look at Japan's military revival, not from Washington, not from Beijing, but from New Delhi. Part 1. Why is Japan rearming? For decades, Japan's defense policy was shaped by the extraordinary legacy of the Second World War. Its constitution, domestic politics, and strategic culture imposed significant restraints on the use of military power. Japan relied heavily on its alliance with the United States, while its self-defense forces remained primarily focused on defending Japanese territory. But the strategic environment around Japan has changed dramatically. China has become a major military and naval power. North Korea possesses increasingly sophisticated missile capabilities. Russia remains an important military actor in the region, and the possibility of a major conflict involving Taiwan has fundamentally changed Japanese strategic calculations. Tokyo increasingly recognizes that simply waiting for an attack and then defending Japanese territory may no longer be enough. Modern warfare begins long before missiles hit cities. It begins with surveillance, cyber warfare, electronic warfare, long-range missiles, space systems, naval deployments, and the ability to strike military assets from hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Japan is therefore building a military capable of operating in this new environment. In March 2026, Japan's Ministry of Defense announced that the destroyer JS Chokai had acquired the capability to launch American Tomahawk standoff missiles, another major step in Japan's evolving long-range strike capability. Tokyo describes these capabilities as necessary for self-defense. But strategically, the message is much larger. Japan is becoming capable of imposing costs at greater distances, and that changes the balance of power in East Asia. Part 2. This is not the return of Imperial Japan. But there is an important distinction. When we hear the phrase, Japan is rearming, it is tempting to think about Imperial Japan. That would be a mistake. Today's Japan is fundamentally different. It is a democratic state. It operates within an alliance with the United States. It is developing strategic partnerships with Australia, India, and other Indo-Pacific countries. And its military expansion is being driven primarily by deterrence and national defense. Japan's own defense policy describes its security environment as increasingly severe and emphasizes stronger integrated air and missile defense alongside standoff capabilities. So the real question is not, is Japan becoming militaristic again? The more important question is Japan becoming capable enough to defend itself in an increasingly dangerous Asia? And from India's perspective, that is a very different question. Because if Japan becomes a stronger military power, China has another major strategic problem to consider. And that brings us to India. Part 3. Why India should welcome a stronger Japan. India and Japan occupy different geographical theaters. Japan is positioned in the Western Pacific. India sits at the center of the Indian Ocean. But both countries face the consequences of China's growing power. India faces China directly across the Himalayas. India also faces the growing Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Japan faces China in the East China Sea and the Western Pacific. This means something extremely important. India and Japan do not have identical strategic interests, but their interests increasingly overlap. And this is where Japanese military power can become useful to India. Think about China's strategic problem. Beijing has to consider India on its western frontier. It has to consider Taiwan. It has to consider the South China Sea. It has to consider the United States. and increasingly it has to consider a much more capable Japan. Every additional theater creates another strategic calculation. Every additional capable military creates another potential constraint. And that is why India does not necessarily need Japan to become an Indian military ally. India simply benefits from Japan becoming strong enough to make Chinese strategic planning more complicated. That is a very different proposition. Part 4. India and Japan are already building the partnership. And this isn't merely theoretical. India and Japan have spent years building a relationship that is increasingly strategic. Their relationship was elevated to a special strategic and global partnership in 2014. Today, cooperation extends across defense, infrastructure, investment, technology, economic security, and the Indo-Pacific. And the defense relationship is becoming increasingly practical. In July 2026, India and Japan conducted their 8th Defense Policy Dialogue in Tokyo and reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening bilateral defense cooperation and the special strategic and global partnership. Earlier this year, the 7th edition of Exercise Dharma Guardian brought Indian Army and Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force personnel together in Uttarakhand. The exercise focused on joint planning, tactical drills, and the ability to conduct combined operations. There is also a logistics dimension. India and Japan already have an agreement allowing reciprocal provision of supplies and services between their armed forces but during approved activities. That matters because modern military power isn't only about weapons. It is about logistics, interoperability, information, and access. And the two countries are gradually developing all four. So, pause here for a moment. India isn't watching Japan from a distance. India is already building the foundations of a strategic partnership with Japan, and as Japanese military capabilities increase, the value of that partnership increases as well. Part 5. The China factor. Now we reach the central strategic issue: China. India doesn't need Japan to become an anti-China military power. In fact, that would be the wrong objective. India's strategic culture is based heavily on autonomy. New Delhi does not want to become an extension of Washington, and it doesn't need to become an extension of Tokyo either. But strategic autonomy does not mean strategic isolation. India can cooperate with other major powers whenever their interests converge with India's own. Japan is one of those powers. A stronger Japan creates an additional military center in Asia. Japanese naval forces can complicate Chinese maritime planning. Japanese air power can complicate Chinese air operations. Japanese missile defense systems can strengthen deterrence. Japanese long-range capabilities can force Beijing to consider the vulnerability of its own military assets. And Japanese geography is crucial. Japan sits close to some of the most important strategic waterways in the Western Pacific. So if China has to plan for a stronger Japan, a stronger United States, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and India simultaneously, the strategic environment becomes much more complicated. And strategic complexity itself can be a form of deterrence. Part 6. Japan can also help India economically and technologically. But there is another dimension to this relationship, and it is not military. It is economic. Japan has invested heavily in India's infrastructure and industrial development. Japanese companies have become important partners in India's economic transformation. And the two countries are increasingly cooperating on technology, innovation, and economic security. This is strategically important because future military power will depend increasingly on industrial capacity. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, sensors, robotics, advanced manufacturing, cyber systems, unmanned platforms, space technology, supply chains. The military powers of tomorrow will be those that control these technologies, and Japan has extraordinary industrial and technological strengths. India has scale, a huge domestic market, engineering capabilities, and an expanding defense industrial base. The combination could become extremely powerful. Instead of simply buying weapons from one another, India and Japan can increasingly explore co-development, co-production, and technology partnerships. That could make the relationship far more important than a conventional defense partnership. Part 7. This is not an alliance. But India must also remain realistic. Japan is not India's military ally in the traditional sense. Japan's first responsibility is the defense of Japan. Its primary strategic concerns include China, North Korea, and Russia. Its alliance with the United States remains fundamental to its national security. India's priorities are different. India has to deal with China along the Himalayas, Pakistan, the Indian Ocean, the security of the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal, and India's wider neighborhood. So India and Japan should not pretend that their strategic objectives are identical. They aren't, but they don't have to be. Strategic partnerships are built on converging interests, not identical interests, and the convergence between India and Japan is becoming increasingly strong. Both want a stable Indo-Pacific. Both support freedom of navigation and a rules-based regional order. Both have concerns about unilateral attempts to change the status quo through coercion, and both benefit from a balance of power in Asia. That is enough. Part 8. The future. A stronger Japan, a stronger India. The real opportunity now is to take this relationship to the next level. More military exercises, more maritime cooperation, more intelligence and information sharing, more defense technology cooperation, more industrial partnerships, more resilient supply chains, more cooperation in space, cyber and artificial intelligence, and potentially much deeper cooperation in naval technology and unmanned systems. India should encourage all of it, but without abandoning strategic autonomy, because India's objective should not be to create an anti-China alliance. The objective should be to create a balanced Asia, an Asia where China is powerful, but not overwhelmingly dominant. An Asia where Japan is strong enough to defend itself, and India strong enough to protect the Indian Ocean, an Australia capable of contributing to regional security, and a United States capable of maintaining the wider strategic balance. That is a much more stable architecture than one in which a single power becomes overwhelmingly dominant. Strategic Vanguard take. So should India welcome Japanese rearmament? Yes, but strategically, not emotionally. India should welcome a Japan that is strong enough to defend itself. India should welcome a Japan capable of deterring coercion. India should welcome Japanese investment, technology, and industrial cooperation. And India should welcome deeper military cooperation between the two countries. But India should not view Japan simply as a weapon against China. Japan is much more valuable than that. It is an increasingly capable Asian power with whom India shares economic interests, technological opportunities, and a broad strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific. And there is a fascinating strategic equation emerging. Japan sits at one end of the Indo-Pacific. India sits at another critical center. China sits between multiple strategic theaters. And the stronger India and Japan become individually, and the closer they become strategically, the harder it becomes for any single power to dominate the region. Conclusion. Japan's military revival is therefore much more than a Japanese story. It is an Asian story. And for India, it could become an important strategic opportunity. India does not need Japan to fight China's battles. India does not need Japan to join an anti-China alliance. India does not even need Japan to become a formal military ally. India benefits simply from Japan becoming strong enough that China has to think twice. That is the real strategic significance of Japanese rearmament. The return of Japanese military power does not necessarily mean the return of an old threat. From India's perspective, it may represent something very different. The emergence of a new strategic partner and another pillar in the balance of power in Asia. This is Strategic Vanguard. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to Strategic Vanguard for more Indian perspective analysis of defense, geopolitics, military technology, and the changing balance of power. Because in the Indo-Pacific, power is not just about who becomes stronger. It is also about who prevents anyone else from becoming overwhelmingly strong.